The bells of St. Aldwyn's had barely finished ringing 7 when Marigold Hale dropped to her knees in the mud, gathering what remained of a week's labor. Crushed marigolds, broken lavender stems, rose petals scattered like blood across the cobblestones. She had arranged those flowers before dawn, tying each bundle with care, arranging them in baskets she would sell to the fine ladies of the county before noon. Now they lay ruined beneath a stranger's boots, and the stranger himself had not even glanced down to see what he'd destroyed. He was already walking away. Tall, dark greatcoat, the kind of unhurried stride that belonged to men who never had to look where they stepped, because the world simply moved aside for them. "You there!" He did not stop. Marigold was on her feet before she'd decided to stand, weaving through startled stall holders and overturned baskets, her boots slapping against wet stone. She caught him by the sleeve first. When he did not so much as turn his head, something in her chest snapped clean through. The same something that had kept her working 18-hour days since her father's death. The same stubbornness that refused to let the world walk over her twice. She reached up and seized him by the ear. Hard. "Do you know what you've done?" she demanded, hauling him half a step sideways so he was forced to bend toward her. "A week's work ruined under your boots, and you cannot even trouble yourself to look where you're going?" The square went quiet in the particular way a crowded place goes quiet when everyone suddenly wishes to be somewhere else. The gentleman, and up close Marigold noted with some irritation, he was younger than she'd expected, with a jaw like carved granite and eyes the gray of a coming storm, said nothing at all. He simply looked at her. Not with fury, not with the outrage she'd braced herself for, with something closer to astonishment, as though nobody had touched him without permission in a very long time. "You will apologize," Marigold said, "and you will pay for what you've ruined. Every stem. I don't care who you think you are." "Marigold." Old Tam Whitlock's voice cracked from somewhere behind her, thin with horror. "Marigold, girl, let go of him this instant." "Not until he apologizes." "Marigold, that is his grace." She heard it then. The particular tone reserved for names spoken in church. She turned, ear still firmly pinched between her fingers, and saw what the rest of the square had already seen. 4 liveried footmen frozen mid-stride, a carriage bearing a crest of black and silver drawn up at the square's edge, and every hat in Brambleford coming off at once, as though pulled by the same invisible string. "His Grace," Tam finished, barely above a whisper. "The Duke of Ravenshire." Marigold's hand did not move. Her mind, however, performed a rapid and thorough collapse. Duke Cedric Ravenshire. The name alone had emptied rooms in 3 counties. Merchants who displeased him lost their licenses within the week. A magistrate had once fined a farmer double simply for the crime of letting sheep wander onto Ravenshire land. He was spoken of the way one spoke of weather that might turn violent, with respect and no small amount of fear. And she was holding him by the ear in front of half the county. Slowly, carefully, as though releasing a viper, Marigold let go. The silence stretched. Somewhere a cartwheel creaked. A dog barked once and thought better of it. Duke Ravenshire straightened his coat with 2 unhurried movements, touched the ear she'd assaulted, and regarded her with an expression she could not read at all. Marigold's stomach dropped somewhere near her boots. She thought of the stories. A tenant family evicted for a debt of 6 shillings, a shopkeeper ruined for daring to raise his prices. She thought of her mother, waiting at home with 3 younger children and no one else to bring in a wage. She began, and found she had no idea how the sentence should end. An apology felt like surrender. Silence felt like defiance she could not afford. The Duke's gaze moved past her to the crushed flowers scattered across the stones, the baskets overturned, the ruin of a week's careful work. Something shifted behind his eyes, brief, unreadable, gone before she could name it. "You are quite right," he said. The words landed in the square like a dropped plate. "I did not look where I was walking. That was careless of me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a purse, and without counting, without so much as glancing at its contents, pressed it into her hand. "For the flowers, and for the trouble." Marigold stared at the purse, stared at him. "I don't want your pity," she said before she could stop herself. The faintest line appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, gone too quickly to be certain it had been there at all. "It isn't pity. It's payment owed." He inclined his head, the smallest fraction a duke could offer a flower seller and still call it a bow, and turned back toward his carriage. The footman scrambled to open the door. The crowd remained frozen, hats in hands, as the carriage rolled away down the lane and out of Brambleford entirely. Tam Whitlock found his voice first. "Girl," he breathed, "do you know what you've just done?" Marigold looked down at the purse in her hand, heavier than any coin she'd held in a year, and at the ruined flowers still scattered across the cobblestones. She did not know, not yet, that she had just changed the whole shape of her life. Fenwick Cottage, Willowbrook Village, Day 3. By the second day, all of Brambleford knew the story, and by the third, it had traveled well beyond it. Marigold heard it told back to her twice at market, once by a cheesemonger who swore she'd boxed the Duke's ears with both hands, once by a farmer's wife who claimed his grace had nearly had her thrown in the stocks before changing his mind out of pure astonishment. Neither version bore much resemblance to what had actually happened, but Marigold had stopped correcting people by noon. It seemed a waste of breath. What she could not stop was the fear that crept in each evening, once the cottage was quiet and her younger brothers and sister were asleep. A man like the Duke did not forget an insult. Everyone said so. He had let her go with coin and a bow, yes, but men of his standing were not known for mercy freely given. Perhaps he was waiting. Perhaps the purse had been a kindness meant to lower her guard before the true reckoning arrived. She was proven right on the third morning, though not in the manner she expected. A carriage came up the lane just after breakfast, dark, unmarked, but for a small crest she now recognized at a glance. Black and silver, wolf and rose. Marigold's mother went pale at the window. Her youngest brother, Tom, pressed his face to the glass with the shameless curiosity of a boy of 9. "He's come to ruin us," her mother whispered. Marigold set down the mending in her lap and went to the door herself, chin lifted, because whatever was coming, she would not meet it cowering. The Duke stepped down from the carriage alone, without footman, dressed more plainly than she'd seen him in the square. Dark coat, no ornament, hat in hand, as though he'd come calling on an equal. He looked, if anything, uncertain of his welcome, which struck Marigold as a strange thing for a duke to look. "Miss Hale." He said her name carefully, as though he'd asked someone for it. "I hoped I might have a word." Behind her, she heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. "If it's about the ear," Marigold said, "I'll not apologize for it. You ruined a week's work and never looked down to see it." "I've not come for an apology." A pause. "I've come with an offer of employment, if you'll hear it." She had expected many things from this visit, a fine for insolence, a warning, perhaps eviction papers for a debt she didn't know her family owed. She had not expected this. "Employment," she repeated. "My estate gardens have been neglected some years. I require someone who understands flowers, and understands them properly, not merely as decoration for a lady's parlor. Your work in the square told me you know what you're about." He hesitated, and Marigold noted it, filed it away. A duke, hesitating. "I can offer fair wages, better than fair if the work is done well." Marigold's mind moved quickly to the practical shape of things. Wages that would keep her family fed through winter, coin enough perhaps to mend the cottage roof before the rains came in earnest. And beneath the practical calculation, something else. A flicker of curiosity she did not examine too closely, about a man who apologized for crushing flowers and returned 3 days later not with punishment, but with work. "Blackthorne Manor," she said. Everyone in the county knew the name, though few had seen the gardens themselves. "They say nothing's grown there in years. They say a great many things." His voice was flat, but something moved behind his eyes again, the same flicker she'd caught in the square. "Will you come, Miss Hale?" She thought of her mother's face at the window. She thought of 6 shillings a week, perhaps more, and boots for Tom before winter bit down hard. "I'll come," she said. "But I'll speak to you as I speak to any customer, Your Grace. I'll not curtsy and simper because you've a title. If the work's poor, I'll say so. If you're wrong about something, I'll say that too." For a moment she thought she'd overreached, that the brief warmth in his expression would curdle into the cold fury the county so feared. Instead, something almost like relief crossed his face, there and gone as quickly as before. "I should like that very much," he said. "I've had quite enough of curtsying and simpering to last several lifetimes." The journey to Blackthorne Manor took the better part of an hour, the carriage rattling along lanes edged with hedgerow and late summer wildflowers Marigold catalogued without meaning to. Foxglove, cow parsley, the last of the meadowsweet. The Duke said little, and she found she did not mind the silence. It gave her leave to study him properly for the first time. The stiff set of his shoulders, even when there was no one to observe him, the way his gaze drifted to the window and stayed there, fixed on nothing in particular. He answered when she spoke to him. He asked after her family, her work, the flowers she favored, and why. But beneath the correct and careful conversation, Marigold sensed something guarded. A door kept shut so long the hinges had rusted over. She thought of the stories again, the fear that clung to his name through 3 counties, and wondered, watching him watch the passing fields, whether any of it had ever been about cruelty at all. By the time Blackthorne Manor rose gray and silent above the trees, Marigold Hale had already decided one thing. Whatever waited behind those walls, she would not be frightened of it. Blackthorne Manor, Day 4. Blackthorne Manor did not so much welcome visitors as endure them. Marigold saw it first through the carriage window, gray stone rising 3 stories against a sky gone the color of pewter, ivy clinging to the west wing in patches like old scars, tall windows that reflected nothing but cloud. It was not a ruin. Every slate on the roof sat in its proper place. Every pane of glass was whole. And yet the house had the stillness of a room where someone has just stopped speaking, and Marigold understood, before she'd even stepped down from the carriage, that this was a house holding its breath. A butler met them at the door, a stooped man with a face carved from patience, who bowed to the Duke and cast Marigold a glance she could not quite place, not disdain exactly, something closer to pity. "Wilkins will show you to the gardens," the Duke said. "I've matters to attend to. He'll answer whatever questions you have." He left her there in the entrance hall without another word, disappearing down a corridor with the same unhurried stride she'd first seen crossing the market square. Marigold watched him go and felt, oddly, as though she'd disappointed him somehow, though she could not think how. "This way, miss," Wilkins said. The manor's interior matched its face. Portraits lined the corridors, gilt frames dulled with dust no one had troubled to clean. A grand staircase swept upward into shadow. Somewhere far off, a clock ticked, but Marigold heard no voices, no laughter, none of the ordinary clatter of a household going about its day. The maids they passed moved like they were afraid of the sound of their own footsteps. "Has it always been so quiet?" Marigold asked, unable to help herself. Wilkins did not answer at once. "Not always, miss," he said finally. "This way to the gardens, if you please." The gardens, when she reached them, told the same story as the house, only louder. What had once been formal beds lay choked with bindweed and nettle, A fountain stood dry and cracked at its center, moss creeping up through the stone basin. Rose bushes that might once have climbed a trellis in careful rows had gone wild, thorny and untended, strangling what remained of a boxwood hedge beneath them. It was not, Marigold thought, the neglect of laziness. It was the neglect of a place deliberately left alone, as though someone had decided long ago that beauty here was no longer permitted. "Well," she said aloud, mostly to herself, "there's work enough." She spent the morning walking the grounds with Wilkins trailing a respectful distance behind, noting what could be saved and what could not, sketching rough plans in the small notebook she carried everywhere. By midday she had decided on a course: clear the worst of the bindweed first, save the roses if they could be saved, bring color back to the beds nearest the house before winter closed the season entirely. It was while cutting fresh stems from a hardy patch of asters near the terrace that she noticed the curtains. Every window on the ground floor was shuttered fast against the daylight, heavy velvet drawn tight even at noon, as though the house preferred darkness to sun. Marigold stood with an armful of flowers and stared up at them for a long moment, and something in her, the same something that had marched her across a crowded square without thinking twice, decided the matter before her better sense could object. She gathered her cut flowers, marched back inside, and began opening every curtain she passed. Wilkins found her 3 rooms deep into the west wing, wrestling a set of heavy drapes that had clearly not moved in years, dust rising in a cloud that made her sneeze twice before the fabric finally gave way, and light flooded across a room that had plainly once been a music room, its pianoforte shrouded under a dust sheet like a body laid out for burial. "Miss," Wilkins said, alarm plain in his voice, "His Grace does not care for the curtains to be—" "Then His Grace can tell me so himself." Marigold set a jug of her cut flowers on the mantel, stepping back to survey the effect. Sunlight pouring gold across faded upholstery, dust motes turning to something almost pretty in the light. "No house should feel like a place where joy's been locked away, Wilkins. It isn't good for the walls, and it certainly isn't good for whoever lives inside them." She did not know the Duke was standing in the doorway until she turned and found him there. He was looking not at her, but past her, at the room itself, the dust sheet still draped over the pianoforte, the flowers on the mantel, the light where there had been none for years. His expression was unreadable in the way it had been in the market square, but his stillness had changed its character entirely. This was not the stillness of a man withholding anger. It was the stillness of a man remembering something he had worked very hard to forget. "My mother played that instrument," he said quietly. Marigold's bravado faltered just slightly. "I didn't know. I can close it again if—" "No." He crossed to the window, one hand resting briefly against the frame, gaze fixed on the garden beyond, wild and overgrown, and here and there, beginning to bloom again under her hand. "Leave it open." Wilkins, standing at the door, said nothing at all, but Marigold caught the look that passed across his face. Quiet, startled, the expression of a man who had not seen his master stand in sunlight for a very long time. And though the Duke's face gave away almost nothing, Marigold thought, just for a moment, that the corner of his mouth had lifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough to leave her wondering, for the rest of that long, quiet afternoon, what exactly she had begun to uncover inside Blackthorne Manor's silent walls. Blackthorne Manor Gardens, 1 week later. A week's work had already begun to show. The worst of the bindweed had been cleared from the terrace beds, the fountain scrubbed free of moss, though it still stood dry, and the maids, emboldened perhaps by Marigold's example, had taken to leaving at least one set of curtains open each morning without being asked. Wilkins pretended not to notice. Marigold pretended not to notice him pretending. It was the old head gardener, Josiah Fenn, who led her at last to the far corner of the grounds, past a stretch of overgrown yew hedge she had assumed simply marked the boundary wall. "There's a rose garden back here, miss," he said, working his stiff shoulders through the gap in the hedge. "Or there was, once. His Grace never asked me to touch it." I've kept the worst of the weeds down out of respect, nothing more." Marigold followed him through and stopped. The garden beyond the hedge was smaller than the others, enclosed on 3 sides by old brick walls gone soft with lichen, and every inch of it had been given over to roses. Climbing roses, gone wild across the walls in great tangled sheets, old shrub roses grown into thickets taller than Marigold herself. Even neglected, even choked with a decade's worth of unchecked growth, the beauty of what had once been planted here was plain. Someone had loved this garden with great care. At its center stood a low stone bench, and behind it, half swallowed by a climbing rose gone wild in white and deep crimson, a small marble memorial. Marigold pushed the branches aside gently, careful of the thorns, and read the inscription cut into the weathered stone. Beatrice, Duchess of Ravenshire, beloved wife, beloved mother. The garden remembers what the world forgets. "His mother," Marigold said quietly. Josiah nodded slowly, easing himself down onto the edge of a low wall, his old joints protesting the movement. "Duchess Beatrice planted every rose in this garden herself, miss, over near 20 years, knew each bush by name near enough. His Grace used to follow her about as a boy, carrying her basket, asking her the names of things." He paused, his gaze drifting over the wild tangle of blooms. "She passed when he was but 22, sudden fever, taken within a fortnight. He'd not long come into the title before that, his father gone some years prior, and I think losing her so soon after was more than a young man ought to bear alone." Marigold sat slowly on the bench, the memorial at her back, and let the silence settle a moment before she spoke. "What happened after?" "He shut the garden gate and never opened it again. Told me to let the roses grow as they pleased, so long as the wall didn't come down. Stopped attending the assemblies, the county gatherings, all the things a young duke's meant to do. Buried himself in the estate ledgers instead, tenant matters, rents, the running of the place. Kept the house quiet, the curtains drawn." Josiah shook his head, slow and sorrowful. "I've served this family 30 years, miss, and I tell you truly, I've not heard that boy laugh since the day they buried her." Marigold thought of the market square, the strange stillness of the Duke as she'd scolded him, the astonishment in his face at being touched at all, spoken to plainly, treated as an ordinary man rather than a title to be feared. She thought of the music room, sunlight falling at last across a shrouded pianoforte, and the quiet way he'd said leave it open. Not cruelty, not coldness worn deliberately the way the county gossips told it, a duke grown hard and unfeeling, delighting in the fear his name inspired. Grief. Ordinary, aching grief, dressed up in fine coats and cold silence because a man in his position was not permitted to weep in front of his tenants, his servants, his county. "He's built a wall round himself," she said slowly, half to Josiah, half to herself. "Same as this one." She glanced at the brick enclosing the garden, softened with moss but unmistakably a boundary all the same. "Keeps everything shut in, so nothing more can be taken from him." "Aye, miss." Josiah's eyes were kind, watching her. "That'd be my thinking too, though I've not the words for it as you've put them." Marigold rose from the bench and walked slowly among the wild roses, letting her fingers trail over blooms that had not been pruned or shaped in 10 years, and yet, still, stubbornly, bloomed each summer regardless. There was something in that, she thought, something that had gone on growing beneath all that neglect, waiting only for someone to clear the path back to it. She thought of her own father, 3 years gone now, and the year she'd spent afterward barely speaking, barely rising from her bed some mornings, until the weight of feeding her brothers and sister had forced her hand back to work, whether her heart was ready or not. Grief did not vanish. It only learned, eventually, to sit differently in the chest. Perhaps the Duke had never been given the chance to learn that, Perhaps no one in this house, in this whole gray, silent county, had ever dared to make him. "Josiah," she said, turning back toward the gap in the hedge, a plan already taking shape behind her eyes. "I should like your help with something. This garden's not for touching, I understand that. But there's no reason the rest of the grounds can't bloom fit to rival it. Every corner, every window box." She glanced back once more at the memorial, half hidden in climbing roses, and something in her chest settled, firm and certain. "If His Grace won't let color back into this garden, then we'll bring it to every other inch of His life instead, whether He asks for it or not." Josiah Fenn, watching her with the particular fondness of an old man who had waited a long while to see something worth hoping for, allowed himself the faintest smile. "I'll fetch my shears, miss," he said, "and glad of it." Eldermere Village Green, 2 weeks later. The gardens of Blackthorne Manor had begun, slowly, to remember themselves. The terrace beds burst with late chrysanthemums and asters, the fountain ran clear water once more, and even Wilkins had stopped pretending not to notice the open curtains, remarking one morning that the breakfast room caught the sun rather handsomely now, if anyone cared to observe it. The Duke observed a great deal in Marigold's experience, and said very little about most of it. So it surprised her greatly when, on the morning of the Eldermere Harvest Festival, he appeared at the edge of the terrace where she was cutting flowers for the house, dressed plainly, without his usual escort of grooms and footmen trailing behind. "I understand the village holds its festival today," he said, in the careful tone of a man testing ground he was not certain would hold his weight. "They do." Marigold straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Pies and ribbon dancing and old widow Cotter's cider, which I'll warn you is stronger than it looks." "I thought I might attend." Marigold nearly dropped her shears. In 4 weeks at Blackthorne Manor, she had learned the Duke did not attend village gatherings. He sent coin, generously and without fail, but he did not go himself, and nobody in Eldermere expected him to. "Well," she said, recovering herself, "you'd best come along then, before you change your mind." He did not change his mind, though she watched him hesitate at the edge of the village green, as though the noise and color of it might overwhelm him. Fiddle music tumbling out from beneath the striped awning, the whole of Eldermere turned out in their good clothes, with baskets of late apples and jars of preserve set out for judging. Marigold did not give him time to retreat. She caught his sleeve, exactly as she had in the market square weeks before, and pulled him toward the nearest stall before he could think better of it. "You'd try Mrs. Fenwick's pie," she informed him, already handing over coin before he could protest. "It's the best in the county, and she'll be wounded if you don't." He tried the pie. He judged, with evident and increasing seriousness, a dispute between 2 small girls over whose flower crown deserved the blue ribbon, settling the matter with such careful diplomacy that both girls walked away satisfied and considerably in awe of him. He allowed Tom, Marigold's youngest brother, to drag him bodily toward the maypole and instruct him, at length and with great authority for a boy of 9, on the correct method of tying ribbon. And somewhere between the pie and the maypole, watching him laugh, really laugh, head tipped back, the sound rusty with disuse but entirely genuine, at Tom's thoroughly mangled attempt to explain the ribbon dance, Marigold felt something shift quietly in her own chest that she was not yet ready to examine. "You should do that more often," she told him, once the laughter had settled into something softer. "Do what?" "Laugh. It suits you a great deal better than the frown everyone in this county seems to expect of you." He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen before, not even in the rose garden's shadow, not even with sunlight pouring across his mother's shrouded pianoforte. "I had rather forgotten how," he admitted quietly. "Until recently." It was not until later, as the fiddle music picked up and couples began forming for the evening dances, that Marigold noticed they were being watched. Lady Rosalind Wycliffe stood at the edge of the green with her party, dressed in silk far too fine for a village festival, her gaze fixed not on the dancing, but on Marigold and the Duke, standing rather closer together than propriety strictly demanded. Marigold had heard the name before, the Marquis of Wycliffe's daughter, spoken of in the county as the Duke's most likely match, a suitable pairing everyone assumed would be announced eventually, once His Grace roused himself from his long mourning to attend to such matters. Lady Rosalind's expression, watching them, was not the idle curiosity of a stranger. It was something sharper, something that made the fine hairs on the back of Marigold's neck rise, though she could not have said precisely why. "Who is that girl he's speaking with?" Rosalind asked her companion, not troubling to lower her voice quite enough. "The flower seller, I believe. The one who made such a scene in Brambleford." "Ah." Rosalind's smile did not reach her eyes. "How very charming. His Grace does enjoy his little amusements, I'm told, though they rarely last." Marigold did not hear the remainder of the exchange, carried away as she was by Tom insisting she watch him attempt the ribbon dance himself. But she caught the tail end of Rosalind's expression before she looked away. Cold, calculating. The particular fury of a woman who had watched something she considered rightfully hers slip a little further from her grasp. She thought little of it in the moment, too full of pie and cider and the unexpected sight of a duke laughing beneath a maypole to spare much worry for a stranger's sour look. She would think of it a great deal later, when the trouble came. For now, as evening settled gold and soft over Eldermere village green, she watched Cedric Ravenshire, the most feared man in 3 counties, according to every story she'd ever heard, help a small girl retrieve a ribbon caught in the maypole's tangle, and found she could not, for the life of her, remember why anyone had ever thought him cold at all. Blackthorne Manor and County Magistrates' Hall, several days later. The trouble began, as trouble so often does, with something small enough to be missed entirely. Marigold had spent the better part of a morning arranging flowers for a small supper the Duke was hosting for a handful of neighboring families, the first such gathering Blackthorne Manor had seen in years, and one he had agreed to only after considerable persuasion on her part. She'd chosen late dahlias for the arrangement, deep burgundy and gold, tucked in among sprigs of rosemary from the kitchen garden, and thought nothing more of it once the vases were carried through to the dining room. She thought a great deal more of it 3 hours later, when one of the Fairweather members was found retching violently in the manor's front hall, having plucked and chewed a berry from among the greenery before anyone thought to stop her. The physician was sent for at once. He recovered, thank heaven, though she remained pale and shaken for a full day after. What the physician found, once he'd examined the arrangement itself, turned the recovery into something far graver. Belladonna. Deadly nightshade, its dark berries tucked in among the rosemary sprigs with careful deliberation, the leaves arranged to disguise themselves among the greenery Marigold herself had gathered. "I never touched nightshade," she said over and over, to Wilkins, to the housekeeper, to anyone who would listen, her hands trembling despite herself. "I know every plant on this estate. I'd not be such a fool as to bring poison into a house with people expected." But knowing a thing was true and proving it were 2 very different matters, and by the following morning, word had already reached the county magistrate. She was summoned to Brambleford's Magistrates' Hall 3 days later, and Marigold walked into that cold stone room with her chin lifted and her stomach twisted into knots she was careful not to let show on her face. The room was fuller than she'd expected. Josiah Fenn had come, and Wilkins, and, to her considerable surprise, 6 stall-holders from the market square who had known her since she was old enough to carry a basket. The Duke sat near the front, his face set in the same unreadable stillness she remembered from their first meeting, though she knew him well enough now to see the tension coiled tight beneath it. "The evidence is plain enough," the magistrate said once the physician had given his account. "Nightshade does not find its own way into a bouquet, Miss Hale. Someone placed it there. You arranged the flowers yourself, by your own admission." "I arranged dahlias and rosemary," Marigold said, keeping her voice steady though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I never touched a nightshade berry in my life,
nor would I, knowing full well what it does.
And yet no one else had cause to enter that room before the arrangement was carried through. It was Josiah who rose first, his old joints creaking as he got to his feet. "Begging your pardon, sir, but that's not entirely true. I saw one of the new kitchen maids near the dining room that morning, well before the supper was to begin. Girl by the name of Sally Pruitt, hired only a fortnight past." The magistrate's brow furrowed. "What of it?" It was the Duke who answered, rising slowly, his voice carrying the particular quiet authority that had once emptied a market square in silence. "I did not hire Sally Pruitt. My housekeeper did not hire her either. I made inquiries myself, this very morning, once suspicion fell on Miss Hale." He withdrew a folded letter from inside his coat. "The girl was placed in my household by a third party, through a recommendation that proves, upon investigation, to be entirely false. And she was seen leaving Blackthorne Manor in considerable haste the very afternoon someone fell ill, never to be seen in the county since." A murmur rippled through the hall. Marigold felt the first loosening of the knot in her chest, though she dared not hope too much just yet. "Placed by whom?" the magistrate demanded. "The recommendation letter," the Duke said, "bears the seal of Lady Rosalind Wycliffe's household." The silence that followed was of an entirely different character than the one in the market square weeks before. That had been shock. This was something closer to scandal, spreading through the hall in whispers that grew louder by the second. Marigold's mind moved quickly back through the weeks, Rosalind's cold expression at the harvest festival, the sharp, assessing look that had followed Marigold and the Duke across the village green. She had thought it jealousy, unpleasant but harmless. She had not imagined it capable of this. The magistrate called for further testimony, and it came swiftly once the thread had been pulled. A stable hand who'd seen Sally Pruitt meeting a woman in a fine carriage on the Wycliffe Road 2 days before the supper. A Brambleford innkeeper who recalled the same woman asking pointed questions about the flower seller employed up at the manor. Piece by piece, the case against Marigold unravelled, and the true shape of the scheme emerged in its place, ugly and plain, for the whole hall to see. By the time the magistrate dismissed the charges against her, declaring the matter one for further investigation into Lady Rosalind's conduct rather than Marigold's, the girl herself had gone pale and rigid in her seat at the back of the hall, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. Marigold did not look at her. She looked instead at the Duke, who crossed the hall the moment the magistrate had finished speaking and stood before her without a trace of the careful distance he usually kept. "I never doubted you," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Not for a single moment." "Everyone else did." "Everyone else," he said, "does not know you as I do." Marigold, standing in the cold stone hall with her name only just cleared of poisoning, found herself, absurdly, fighting back tears of an entirely different sort than the fear she'd carried in with her, and understood, with a clarity that startled her, precisely how much that single sentence had come to mean. Grafton Moor and the White Hart Coaching Inn, 1 month later. The scandal of Lady Rosalind's scheme had not vanished quietly. She had been sent away within the week, packed off to a distant relation in the north before the full weight of county gossip could settle on her family's name, and Marigold had heard nothing more of her since. What remained, in the weeks that followed, was something she had not expected, a kind of quiet acceptance that had settled over Blackthorne Manor and the village both, as though the trial had proven, once and for all, that she belonged wherever the Duke chose to have her. It was this new ease that sent her out onto the moor road alone that October afternoon, cart loaded with rare wildflower seed she'd travelled 2 hours to purchase from a grower near the coast, the sky behind her a deceptively pale grey that gave no warning of what was coming. The storm broke with a violence Marigold had never seen in all her years in the county. Rain came sideways across the moor, driven by wind that near tore the reins from her hands, and within a quarter hour the track had turned to a treacherous slick of mud that sent her horse stumbling and the cartwheel sliding hard into a rut deep enough to crack the axle. She was stranded, alone, with dusk closing fast, and no shelter in sight save a distant huddle of stone she could barely make out through the rain. It took her the better part of an hour, soaked through and shaking with cold, to lead the frightened horse the half-mile to what proved to be the White Hart, a small coaching inn set at the crossroads where the moor road met the turnpike. She was not the only traveller seeking refuge there. A mail coach had been forced off its route by the storm, and its passengers, an elderly clergyman, 2 merchants, a young mother with an infant wrapped tight against the cold, crowded the inn's single common room, wet and frightened, and grateful beyond measure for the fire the innkeeper kept fed. Marigold, once she'd seen to her horse and warmed herself enough to stop shaking, found herself doing what she'd always done best. She settled the young mother near the fire with a borrowed blanket, coaxed the frightened infant into quiet with a folded handkerchief turned into a makeshift toy, and kept the elderly clergyman talking of his parish until the worst of his fright had eased into ordinary conversation. She did not know, and could not have known, that word of the missing cart had reached Blackthorne Manor within the hour. The door of the White Hart burst open some time past 9, rain gusting in behind a figure so soaked and mud-spattered that Marigold did not recognize him until he'd already crossed half the room toward her. "Marigold." Cedric's voice cracked on her name in a way she had never once heard it crack, not in the market square, not in the magistrate's hall. His hands found her shoulders, gripping hard enough to hurt, as though he needed the solidity of her to believe she was truly there. "You're unhurt. Tell me you're unhurt." "I'm quite well," she said, startled by the raw edge in his voice. "Only wet and cross about the cart. Cedric, what on earth?" "Josiah found your horse's tracks turned off toward the moor road, and no sign of you at the crossing where you were expected." His grip did not loosen. Behind him she could see 2 of the estate's riders shaking rain from their coats near the door, having clearly ridden the moor themselves, searching every track and hollow. "I have had riders out since the storm broke. I did not know—" He stopped, and something in his face, always so carefully composed, came apart entirely. "I did not know what I would do if I found that cart overturned and you not beside it." Marigold, aware of the room's curious eyes upon them, drew him gently toward the fire and the relative privacy of its far corner, where the noise of the storm, still rattling the windows, covered their voices from the rest of the inn. "I'm here," she said softly. "Safe and warm, and rather better company for these poor stranded travelers than I've any right to claim credit for." He sat heavily on the bench beside her, rain still dripping from his coat, and for a long moment said nothing at all, watching the fire with the same stillness she remembered from their very first conversation in her mother's doorway, when he'd come with an offer of work and something guarded and hesitant beneath his correct, careful words. "I have spent 4 years," he said finally, "believing that caring for anything too deeply was a debt eventually called due. My mother, my father before her. I built Blackthorne Manor into a place where nothing could be taken from me again, because I had made certain there was nothing left inside it worth taking." He turned to look at her then, firelight catching the gray of his eyes, softened now into something Marigold had never seen there before. "And then a flower seller took me by the ear in a market square and would not let me hide from anything again." Marigold's breath caught. "Cedric." "Tonight, riding that moor in the dark, not knowing whether you were safe," he said, "I understood something I have been too great a coward to admit even to myself. Strength was never found in keeping myself shut away from feeling, Marigold. I mistook fear for strength, and I have wasted 4 years believing the two were the same thing." Outside, the storm had begun, at last, to soften, rain settling into a gentler patter against the glass. Marigold looked at the man beside her, mud-spattered, exhausted, stripped of every careful defense he had spent years constructing, and saw, for the first time since that morning in the market square, not the feared Duke of Ravenshire at all. Only Cedric. Only a man who had ridden into a storm for her, and found, somewhere on that dark moor road, the courage to stop hiding from his own heart. Blackthorne Manor Ballroom, early spring. Winter passed slowly at Blackthorne Manor, but it passed differently than any winter Marigold had known there before. The curtains stayed open through every gray afternoon. The music room's pianoforte, uncovered at last, saw regular use once Cedric confessed, somewhat sheepishly, that he still remembered a handful of the pieces his mother had taught him as a boy. By the time the first snowdrops pushed up through the terrace beds, the manor had become something Marigold scarcely recognized from the silent, shuttered house she'd first walked into. Full of ordinary noise, footsteps and laughter and the clatter of a household no longer holding its breath. It was Wilkins who brought the news, one morning in early March, with an expression Marigold had never once seen him wear in all her months at the manor. "His Grace intends to revive the spring assembly," he said, and something in his careful, formal voice cracked just slightly with feeling. "It has not been held since her late Grace's time, not once in 10 years. The county took the announcement with the particular fervor reserved for events long anticipated and suddenly, unexpectedly granted. Invitations went out to every family of consequence for 30 miles, and Blackthorne Manor's ballroom, a room Marigold had not even known existed until Josiah mentioned it, so thoroughly had it been shut away with the rest of the house's grief, was aired, polished, and filled with flowers under her own careful direction for a full week beforehand. She had not expected to receive an invitation herself. It arrived on cream cardstock, edged in silver, addressed in Cedric's own hand rather than a secretary's careful copperplate, and Marigold stood holding it in her mother's small kitchen for a long moment before she could quite make herself believe it. "You cannot mean to go," her mother said, not unkindly, though worry creased her brow. "Marigold, love, those are fine folk, marquises and their daughters. What will they think? A flower seller stood among them." "I don't know," Marigold admitted, "but I mean to find out." She had no gown fine enough for a duke's ballroom, and no coin to spare for silk even if she'd wished it, so she made do with what she had. A simple Regency dress of pale green muslin, let out at the seams and pressed carefully the night before, with fresh white flowers woven through her hair in place of the jewels she did not own and would not have wanted regardless. She looked, she thought, examining herself in her mother's small mirror, exactly like what she was. A flower seller, dressed simply, walking into a room full of silk and diamonds. She held her chin high regardless, and went. The ballroom, when she arrived, was already a blaze of candlelight and color, silk gowns catching the light as couples turned through the opening sets, and Marigold felt every eye in the room find her within moments of her arrival. Not with the open cruelty she'd half braced for, but something colder and more practiced, whispered behind fans and half-turned shoulders. "The flower girl," she heard quite clearly from a cluster of young ladies near the refreshment table. "I hear she assaulted His Grace in the marketplace of all things. How ever did she come to be invited?" "Some say he's quite taken with her," came the reply, delivered with a small, disbelieving laugh. "Though I cannot think what he sees in it. No fortune, no name worth speaking of." Marigold kept walking, kept her chin exactly where it belonged, and found a quiet corner near the tall windows where she might watch the dancing without becoming quite so plainly the object of the room's attention. It was there Cedric found her, not 20 minutes later, cutting through the crowded floor with the same unhurried certainty she remembered from the market square all those months before. "You came," he said, and the warmth in his voice, plain and unguarded in front of half the county, drew several curious glances from the nearest onlookers. "I did." She glanced past him at the assembled room, silk and diamonds and careful, cutting whispers. "Though I begin to think it was a poor decision. I hear I've no fortune worth speaking of." "You have," he said. "The only fortune in this room I have ever found worth speaking of." Before she could answer, before the whispering cluster nearby could finish their next unkind remark, he had extended his hand, palm upward, in a gesture that carried, in that crowded ballroom, the full and unmistakable weight of a declaration. "Dance with me," he said. "The opening set, before the whole of this county, if they've a mind to watch." Marigold hesitated only a moment, long enough to feel the room's attention sharpen around them, long enough to see, at the edge of her vision, several older ladies drawing themselves up in visible disapproval, before she placed her hand in his. "They'll talk of nothing else for weeks," she warned him quietly as he led her toward the floor. "Let them." His grip on her hand was steady, certain, entirely without the guarded stillness she remembered from their first weeks together. "I have spent 4 years allowing this county's opinion to dictate the shape of my life. I find I have rather lost my taste for it." The music began. Cedric led her into the opening turn of the dance himself, before the assembled eyes of every marquess and duchess and disapproving dowager in 3 counties. And if the whispers had not entirely quieted by the time the second set began, they had, at the very least, changed their character considerably, from cutting disbelief to something closer, grudgingly, to reconsideration. By the time the candles had burned low and the last carriages rolled away down the drive, Marigold Hale, flower seller of Brambleford Market Square, had opened the spring assembly on the arm of the Duke of Ravenshire, and the whole of the county had watched him make plainer than any words could manage exactly where his heart had settled. St. Aldwyn's Parish Church and Blackthorne Manor Gardens, several weeks later. Spring settled properly over the county in the weeks that followed the assembly, and with it came a change in Blackthorne Manor that even the oldest servants remarked upon with something close to wonder. The rose garden behind the yew hedge, left untouched out of respect for 10 long years, had been opened at last, its wild tangle carefully pruned back under Josiah's patient direction until the old bones of Duchess Beatrice's original planting showed through once more, thorny and stubborn and beginning, cautiously, to flourish. Cedric had asked for the gate to be opened himself. Marigold had not suggested it, had been careful never to press him toward a grief that was not hers to hurry, and so, when he'd found her one gray morning tending the terrace beds and told her, quite simply, that he thought his mother would rather have seen the garden tended than left to grow wild in her memory, she had only nodded and fetched her shears without a word. The whispers of the assembly had not vanished entirely, county gossip rarely did, but they had softened considerably, worn down by weeks of seeing the Duke of Ravenshire ride openly to market, laugh without restraint at the village green, and conduct himself, in every particular that mattered, as a man restored rather than a man diminished by his choice of company. Even Lady Rosalind's ruined reputation, spoken of now only in hushed and cautionary tones, seemed to belong to some other, more distant season. The village of Eldermere had turned out in full for the wedding, crowding the small churchyard of St. Aldwyn's until the vicar was obliged to prop the door wide open so those without could hear the vows carried on the spring air. Marigold's mother wept openly through the whole of the ceremony, clutching Tom's hand so tightly the boy complained of it afterward, though not with any real displeasure. Josiah Fenn stood near the back in his best coat, brushed and pressed for the occasion, his old eyes bright with something he did not trouble to hide. Marigold wore no silk, no diamonds, no borrowed finery of any kind. Her gown was simple muslin, pale as the first spring blossoms, with fresh flowers from the terrace beds woven through her hair exactly as they had been at the assembly months before. Because Cedric had asked for nothing else, had told her plainly that he had fallen for a flower seller in a market square, not a lady dressed to resemble one, and he'd have her exactly as she was, or not at all. It was afterward, in the churchyard itself, with the last of the wedding party drifting toward the manor for the breakfast that awaited them, that Cedric drew her aside beneath the old yew tree at the churchyard's edge, roses climbing the low wall behind them in the same deep crimson and white as those tangled round his mother's memorial. "I have been turning something over in my mind," he said, "since the night of the storm." "Only since the storm?" Marigold asked, teasing gently. "I rather thought it a good deal longer than that." Since before, if I am honest, though I lacked the courage to name it properly until that night. He took her hand, turning it over in his own, tracing the small calluses her years of gardening work had left there. Calluses she had once feared he might find distasteful in a duchess's hands, and which he had told her, quite plainly, he considered the finest thing about them. I have thanked you 100 times, I think, for what you did to this house, the curtains, the gardens, the music room. But I do not think I have properly thanked you for what you did to me.
You needn't.
I do. His voice was steady, but something moved behind his eyes, the same unguarded warmth she'd first glimpsed at the White Hart's fireside. I was not a duke worth admiring, Marigold, whatever the county believed of my name. I was a man who had built walls so thoroughly around his own grief that I had very nearly forgotten there was anything left inside them worth protecting. You took me by the ear in a market square and refused to let me hide behind my title, and you have refused it every day since, and I find I am a far better man for it than I ever managed to be alone. Marigold felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, watching the sincerity plain on his face, stripped of every careful defense he had once worn like armor.
I never wanted you to become a different man, she said softly, only to remember the one you already were before grief convinced you to bury him.
Then stay, he said. Not because you have become a duchess today, though I confess I am rather fond of the notion. Stay because you never once feared to speak honestly to me. From the very first morning you found me careless in that square, and I have discovered I cannot imagine my life without someone willing to do so every day that remains to us.
I had rather already decided that,
Marigold told him, laughing despite the tears standing bright in her eyes.
Some months before you thought to ask me properly.
Behind them, the rose garden climbed thick and fragrant along the old brick wall, no longer a monument to grief left untended, but something living again, tended by careful hands that understood loss did not require abandonment to be honored properly. Beyond the churchyard, the fields of Eldamere stretched green and new under the spring sun, and further still, Blackthorne Manor stood with every curtain thrown wide to the light, its silent years behind it at last. The flower seller, who had once scolded a duke in a crowded market square, walked back through the churchyard gate on his arm as his duchess, and the whole county, watching them pass, understood at last what old Josiah Fenn had known from that very first quiet morning in the rose garden. That courage, kindness, and a stubborn refusal to be afraid had done what 10 years of careful, sorrowful silence never could. They had brought Blackthorne Manor, and the man who had nearly forgotten how to love it, fully and finally back into bloom.